On a quiet evening, a friendship older than time is shattered, but who was behind the breaking point? Stay tuned to uncover the secrets. It all started with a single whisper in the dark. A life lost, a trust betrayed. Can you solve the mystery before it unravels completely? The monoplane roared through the cloudless Persian sky, its shadow skimming over the endless golden sands of the desert below. The horizon stretched infinitely, blending the pale blue of Nowruz's dawn with the warm hues of the shifting dunes. Inside the cockpit, PYNE sat stiffly, clutching his seatbelt. Flying in a monoplane was a novelty to him, and the aircraft's occasional lurches did little to ease his nerves. "I assure you, Mr. PYNE, she is a steady bird." Herr Schlegel's voice cut through the drone of the engine. The pilot turned his head slightly, flashing a small, bittersweet smile beneath his meticulously groomed mustache. His accent was thick, his tone melancholic, yet his words carried a practiced charm. "Let us hope so," PYNE replied dryly, though his lips twitched in faint amusement. His sharp eyes surveyed the rugged figure of the German pilot, hands steady on the controls, a faraway look in his pale blue eyes. For a moment, the two sat in companionable silence, the engine's hum a steady backdrop. Then Schlegel spoke again, his voice softer now, almost introspective. "Mr. PYNE," he began, hesitating as if weighing his words, "may I tell you something? Something I have never shared with another soul." PYNE raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I've always believed the truth sounds lighter when shared," he offered, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. Schlegel nodded, his fingers tightening around the yoke. "It was years ago, my first passengers after I began flying commercially. A titled lady from England, Lady Esther Carr, and her companion, a Miss Muriel King." His voice faltered slightly, as if the memory itself carried a weight that pressed on his chest. "Go on," PYNE urged, leaning forward slightly. "They were opposites," Schlegel continued. "Lady Esther, cold, commanding. You could feel the fire beneath her composure like a storm waiting to break. And Miss King. She was radiant, kind, the sort of beauty that takes the air from the room, yet leaves everyone grateful for it." He paused, his gaze fixed ahead. "But it wasn't beauty that caught me. No, it was the way Lady Esther looked at her. Her eyes, Mr. PYNE." The pilot's hands trembled slightly, an uncharacteristic crack in his confident demeanor. "Those eyes were alive with something unholy, a madness I cannot describe. And then," he swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper, "Miss King disappeared." "Disappeared," PYNE echoed, his tone sharpening. Schlegel's laughter was bitter. "Lady Esther claimed it was an accident. A balcony, she said. But I knew better. I saw it in her eyes. The moment we landed, she looked at me with those wild, flashing eyes and said, 'She's gone now, nothing more to say.'" PYNE studied Schlegel intently, noting the beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the cool air circulating the cockpit. "And you believe she killed Miss King?" he asked carefully. "I don't believe it," Schlegel whispered, shaking his head. "I know it. I see her eyes in my dreams, Mr. PYNE. They were not human that day." The plane jolted slightly as Schlegel tightened his grip on the controls. "There is madness in some families, you know," he continued, his voice heavy. "Lady Esther's mother went mad, her grandmother before her. The curse runs deep in the Carr bloodline." PYNE's fingers tapped rhythmically on the armrest, his mind piecing together Schlegel's story. But before he could ask another question, Schlegel glanced at him, his pale eyes clouded with a strange mixture of guilt and fear. "Be careful in Shiraz, Mr. PYNE," he said softly. "If you ever meet someone with eyes like hers, turn away. You'll thank me later." PYNE's heart quickened at the foreboding tone, but before he could respond, Schlegel let out a deep sigh, as though releasing a burden too heavy to carry any longer. "Perhaps I shouldn't have spoken of this," he murmured. "But there are some things one cannot bury, no matter how far one flies." The monoplane began its descent, the city of Shiraz shimmering like a mirage on the horizon. As the aircraft dipped lower, Schlegel's final words hung in the air like an ominous shadow. "I still see her eyes in my dreams, Mr. PYNE," he said, his voice a low, haunted whisper. They were not human that day. The scene ended with PYNE staring out of the window, the desert wind rattling the monoplane, his mind racing with questions. What had truly happened between Lady Esther Carr and Muriel King? And how deep did the madness run? Arrival at Shiraz. The monoplane landed with a groan of its wheels on the sun-baked runway. Parker PYNE stepped out, greeted by the intense scent of orange blossoms carried on the dry breeze. The city of Shiraz sprawled before him, its domes and rooftops shimmering under the Nowruz sun. Not far from the edge of the city, a striking silhouette caught his attention. A grand mansion perched on a slight rise, framed against the tomb of the poet Hafez. The mansion stood veiled in shadows despite the brightness of the day, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes staring into the distance. There was a strange air about the place, a sense of abandonment, yet an unshakable presence. "Quite the sight, isn't it?" came a voice from behind. PYNE turned to find a stocky man in a crisp linen suit approaching him. His ruddy face bore the stamp of authority, yet his smile seemed rehearsed, almost too wide. "Henry Babcock, English consul." The man introduced himself with a firm handshake. "And you must be Parker PYNE. I received word of your arrival." "Shiraz is lovely," PYNE remarked, his eyes drifting back to the mansion. "But that house, it seems to brood over the city." Babcock followed his gaze and let out a low chuckle, though it lacked warmth. "Ah, that's the Carr residence. Belongs to Lady Esther. She's been holed up there for years, quite the recluse. I wouldn't recommend getting too curious about her, Mr. PYNE." "And why is that?" PYNE asked casually, his tone inviting more than politeness allowed. "Well," Babcock began, lowering his voice as though the very walls of the city might eavesdrop, "she's not the most stable of individuals. The locals whisper about her, of course, but they've been whispering ever since her companion died." PYNE's interest piqued. Her companion. "A Miss Muriel King," Babcock replied, his face darkening. "Lovely young woman. Tragic, really. She fell from a balcony carrying a breakfast tray, of all things. Broke her neck instantly. Lady Esther said it was an accident, but—" He trailed off, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But," PYNE prompted, his tone sharpened like a scalpel. Babcock hesitated, then leaned in conspiratorially. "Well, there are those who believe Lady Esther had something to do with it. She's erratic, haunted even. Some say the Carr family bloodline carries madness." The word madness hung in the air like an unwelcome guest, but PYNE only nodded thoughtfully. "Fascinating. And yet, she remains in that house alone." Babcock gave a sardonic smile. "She does. Keeps to herself, rarely leaves, and certainly never entertains visitors. The housekeeper delivers her meals through the side entrance. Occasionally the doctor makes a call, but that's about it." PYNE's gaze drifted back to the mansion. "You mentioned madness runs in her bloodline. Is that so?" "Oh yes," Babcock said with a theatrical shudder. "Her grandmother was institutionalized, you know. Her mother died under unusual circumstances. It's no wonder Lady Esther isn't quite right herself, and then here is her eyes." PYNE's head tilted slightly, his interest sharpening. "Her eyes?" "Yes, dark and flashing, piercing even," Babcock said with an exaggerated gesture. "Quite unusual for someone whose parents both had blue eyes, don't you think?" A spark of suspicion flickered in PYNE's mind. Schlegel's words from the flight echoed in his memory. "I still see her eyes in my dreams. They were not human that day." "Curious," PYNE murmured, more to himself than to Babcock. "Very curious." The consul shrugged. "Well, if you'll excuse me, I've a meeting with the governor. Enjoy Shiraz, Mr. PYNE, but I'd advise you to steer clear of that house." As Babcock walked away, PYNE lingered on the edge of the bustling square, his eyes fixed on the mansion, A heavy stillness seemed to radiate from the house, as though it was waiting watching. His mind was alight with questions. Why would a woman like Lady Esther live in self-imposed exile? Why the peculiar eyes? And what truly happened on that balcony the day Muriel King fell? Pyne's lips curved into a thoughtful smile as an idea took shape. He would write a letter to Lady Esther. If she wouldn't step out into the world, then the world via Parker Pyne would step into her shadows. "Let's see what secrets you are hiding, Lady Esther," he murmured to himself. As he turned to leave, the shadow of the Carr mansion seemed to stretch across the square, following him like an unseen presence. The invitation and deception twists begin. The sun was setting when Parker Pyne arrived at the imposing gates of the Carr mansion. The air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the shadows stretched long across the driveway. A liveried servant greeted him without a word, leading him through the overgrown garden and into the cavernous interior of the house. The mansion's grandeur was undeniable, though its beauty was marred by neglect. Chandeliers hung with cobwebs, and the once vivid carpets had faded to muted hues. Pyne's footsteps echoed ominously as he was escorted to the drawing room, a place that felt frozen in time. She was already waiting for him. Lady Esther Carr sat in a high-backed chair, her posture ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly around a delicate porcelain teacup. She was pale, her face framed by raven-black hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Her dark eyes intense and guarded met Pyne's with an unsettling sharpness. "Mr. Pyne," she said in a voice that was both lilting and tremulous, "your letter intrigued me." Pyne offered a polite smile as he took the seat across from her. "I appreciate your invitation, Lady Esther. I admit, your story and your solitude captured my curiosity." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Mr. Pyne. You must know that." "Indeed," Pyne said lightly, "but it can also lead to answers." Lady Esther's grip on her teacup tightened almost imperceptibly. Pyne noticed the faint tremor in her hands, the way her gaze darted to the window as though searching for an escape route. He decided to probe gently. "This house is extraordinary. It must have witnessed so many fascinating moments over the years. England's high society, for instance. Surely you've hosted your share of notable guests." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's been a long time since I entertained anyone, Mr. Pyne." "Ah, but the memories remain," Pyne pressed, leaning forward slightly. "I recall meeting Lord Allerton once. Charming man. He mentioned dining here years ago. His peculiar habit of adding salt to his tea always amused me." Lady Esther's brows furrowed slightly. "Lord Allerton?" she repeated, the name rolling off her tongue awkwardly. "Yes, of course, a delightful man." Pyne's smile didn't waver, but inwardly he noted her hesitation. Lord Allerton didn't exist, had made the name up entirely. "And what of the spring gala?" Pyne continued, his tone casual. "I heard it was the event of the season. Surely you must remember that evening." Her reaction was almost imperceptibly a flicker of confusion in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "I am afraid my memory isn't what it used to be." Pyne nodded thoughtfully. "Understandable, of course. The past can be such a blur, can't it? Especially when it's a past that doesn't quite belong to us." The teacup clattered against the saucer as Lady Esther's hand trembled violently. "I beg your pardon." Pyne's tone remained calm, but his words carried an edge. "I've spent many years observing people, Lady Esther, and you have all the marks of someone carrying a burden, a secret too heavy to bear. Your hesitation, your anxiety, and most telling of all, your unfamiliarity with the world you are meant to belong to." Her breathing quickened, and her dark eyes widened, like a cornered animal. "I don't know what you are implying, Mr. Pyne." "Oh, but I think you do," Pyne said, his voice firm yet devoid of malice. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You are not Lady Esther Carr." The room fell deathly silent. the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Lady Esther's lips parted as though to protest, but no sound came. The blood drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the porcelain teacup she clutched. PYNE continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word deliberate. "You are Muriel King." Her teacup slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor, but she didn't flinch. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her eyes, those dark, flashing eyes, stared at PYNE in a mixture of fear and disbelief. How dare you?" she finally managed, her voice barely audible. PYNE rose from his chair, his expression as unyielding as stone. "Dare I? Or have I merely spoken the truth you've been hiding all this time?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Lady Esther or Muriel remained frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The revelation had cracked her carefully constructed facade, but the full truth still lingered, tantalizingly out of reach. PYNE stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Now, Miss King, shall we stop playing this game and discuss what really happened here?" The scene ended on a razor's edge, leaving the audience desperate to know what secrets would spill forth next. The real story unfolds. The air in the drawing room seemed to thicken, the oppressive silence pressing down on both of them. Muriel, no longer the composed Lady Esther, sat slumped in her chair, her hands clutching the armrests as though they were the only things keeping her grounded. Parker PYNE stood a few feet away, his gaze steady but not unkind. "You think you know everything, don't you, Mr. PYNE?" Her voice was trembling, barely above a whisper. "But you don't. You don't understand what it's like to live in constant fear, to wake up every day wondering if it will be the one where your past catches up with you." PYNE crossed his arms and leaned slightly forward. "Then why not tell me? Trust me, Muriel. The burden of hiding is far heavier than the relief of speaking the truth." Muriel flinched at the sound of her name, her real name. Tears welled in her dark eyes, threatening to spill over, but she quickly wiped them away with trembling fingers. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered. "No one would." "Try me," PYNE said, his tone gentle yet firm. He moved to the armchair opposite her and sat down, his gaze unwavering. "I have a feeling you've been waiting a long time to tell someone your story. Let me be that someone." Her shoulders sagged as if the weight of her secrets had finally become too much to bear. She took a deep, shaky breath before speaking. "It started with her jealousy," Muriel began, her voice barely audible at first. "Lady Esther, she wasn't always like this. When I first met her, she was kind, gracious. But over time, something changed. She grew suspicious, paranoid. And then there was him." "Herr Schlegel," PYNE said quietly, filling in the blank. Muriel nodded, her eyes distant, lost in the memory. "He was charming, magnetic even. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Esther adored him. But Schlegel, he wasn't interested in her. Not in that way. He was kind to her, yes, but his attention." Her voice faltered. "His attention was on me." PYNE listened intently, his sharp mind piecing the puzzle together. "And Lady Esther didn't take kindly to that, did she?" Muriel's laugh was bitter, almost hollow. "Kindly? She hated it. She would watch us, her eyes, those eyes, burning with something I can only describe as madness. One evening, Schlegel complimented my dress at dinner. Just a simple compliment, nothing more. But that night she cornered me in my room, accusing me of trying to steal him away. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She was consumed by jealousy." Muriel's voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. PYNE waited patiently, giving her the space to continue. "And then it happened," she said finally, her voice a strangled whisper. "The morning we were set to leave for Shiraz, she came into my room, wild-eyed, accusing me again. I tried to calm her, but she wouldn't listen. She grabbed my arm, shouting, threatening me. I pulled away and she lost her balance." Muriel's hands dropped to her lap, and she stared at the floor, her expression haunted. She fell, she whispered, right over the balcony. One moment she was there, and the next. PYNE's voice was calm but insistent. It was an accident, Muriel. Anyone can see that. Muriel shook her head violently. It doesn't matter. No one would have believed me. Not with Schlegel's infatuation. Not with her accusations. They would have called it murder, Mr. PYNE. They would have hanged me. So you assumed her identity, PYNE said, the pieces falling into place. You became Lady Esther Carr. Muriel's lips quivered as she nodded. It was the only way. The consul here had never met her, and with Schlegel's sudden departure after her death, there was no one left to question it. I thought I could live her life quietly, fade into the background. But it's been torture, Mr. PYNE. Every knock at the door, every shadow in the night, I've lived in constant fear that someone would discover the truth. PYNE studied her, his expression unreadable. Finally he leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Muriel, no one should have to live like that. Carrying this weight, this guilt, it's no way to exist. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. But what choice do I have, if the truth comes out? The truth, PYNE interrupted, has a way of coming to light, even in the shadows of Shiraz. You can't run from it forever. But I'll help you, Muriel. We'll find a way to make this right. Tears streamed down her face now, and she looked at him as though he were her only lifeline. You'd do that for me. PYNE gave her a small, reassuring smile. You've suffered enough. Let me carry some of the weight. The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. For the first time in years, Muriel felt a flicker of hope. But PYNE knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, that the shadows of Shiraz still held secrets waiting to be uncovered. The final act. The evening air in Shiraz carried a tense stillness as Parker PYNE stood at the edge of the mansion's grand library. The flickering glow of the oil lamps cast long, wavering shadows across the room. Muriel sat nervously on a high-backed chair, her hands tightly gripping the armrests. Schlegel stood near the window, his face grim, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The consul, seated across from Muriel, exuded an air of forced composure, but a bead of sweat trickling down his temple betrayed his unease. PYNE cleared his throat, his voice calm yet commanding. Thank you all for gathering here tonight. I believe it's time we put all the cards on the table. There are truths in this house that have been buried for far too long, and tonight they will come to light. The consul leaned forward, feigning casual interest. Truths, Mr. PYNE. Surely you are being melodramatic. Lady Esther's affairs are her own. PYNE's gaze sharpened as he fixed the consul with an unflinching stare. Oh, I am quite certain you'd like them to remain that way. But you see, I've been doing some digging, and what I've found doesn't paint a very flattering picture of you, Mr. Ambrose. The consul stiffened, his mask of indifference slipping for just a moment. What exactly are you insinuating? I am not insinuating anything, PYNE replied smoothly. I am stating a fact. You've been using Lady Esther's mansion and her supposed reclusive nature conduct your own extracurricular activities. Muriel's eyes widened in alarm. Schlegel turned from the window, his expression darkening. Illegal activities? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. PYNE nodded, pacing slowly across the room. Indeed, smuggling. To be precise, opium, rare artifacts, and even arms. It's a lucrative business, isn't it, Mr. Ambrose? And you've had the perfect cover: an empty mansion, a mad recluse, and no one daring to ask too many questions. The consul's composure cracked. This is preposterous, he barked, slamming his fist on the table. You have no proof. PYNE smiled faintly, unbothered by the outburst. Oh, but I do. You see, I happened to stumble upon a few interesting documents in your office, Mr. Ambrose. Shipping manifests, coded messages, and letters addressed to some rather unsavory characters. Muriel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Schlegel's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. The consul's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is absurd. Ambrose said, his voice shaking. Even if what you are saying is true, what does it have to do with Lady Esther or Muriel? PYNE stopped pacing, turning to face him fully. It has everything to do with Muriel. You see, once I uncovered your little operation, it became clear why you were so invested in keeping up the charade of Lady Esther's reclusiveness. The moment Muriel's true identity was revealed, your smuggling operation would be exposed. After all, who would believe a young woman living under a false identity had no idea what was happening under her own roof? The room fell into a heavy silence. Muriel looked stricken, her eyes darting between PYNE and the consul. Schlegel's expression darkened further, his protective instincts toward Muriel coming to the forefront. PYNE continued, his voice steady. But what truly concerns me is the lengths you've gone to keep your secrets, Mr. Ambrose. The attempts to sabotage Schlegel's arrival, the shadows lurking around this house, the whisper of footsteps in the night. He paused, his piercing gaze locking onto the consul. Tell me, just how far were you willing to go to ensure the truth stayed hidden? Ambrose opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, a loud creak echoed through the room. Everyone froze. The sound had come from behind Muriel, where the shadows loomed darkest. Schlegel moved instinctively, stepping toward Muriel. PYNE raised a hand, signaling him to stay still. Who's there? PYNE demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a shadow shifted, a dark figure emerging from behind the heavy velvet curtains. Muriel let out a stifled scream as Schlegel moved closer, positioning himself between her and the figure. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek. He held a knife, its blade glinting ominously in the lamplight. So clever, aren't you, Mr. PYNE? The man sneered. Too clever for your own good. PYNE's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. Ah, one of Mr. Ambrose's loyal associates, I presume. Let me guess you were sent here to clean up the mess. The man's grin widened. Something like that. But don't worry, I'll make it quick. For all of you. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as Schlegel lunged forward, grabbing a heavy candlestick from the mantel. The man turned, his knife flashing, but Schlegel was faster. A struggle ensued, and PYNE shouted for everyone to get back. The scene ended in chaos, leaving the audience on edge. Who sent the intruder? Will Muriel survive the final confrontation? And will PYNE succeed in unraveling the web of lies before it's too late? The climax. The grand library of the mansion was filled with an almost unbearable tension. The consul, Mr. Ambrose, sat in a high-backed chair, his once proud posture now slouched as the weight of his secrets bore down on him. Schlegel stood protectively beside Muriel, whose pale face was streaked with tears. PYNE, calm yet commanding, stood before them all, holding a small leather-bound diary in his hand. You've spun quite the web, Mr. Ambrose, PYNE began, his voice steady but laced with quiet fury. But all webs eventually collapse under their own weight, and I've just found the thread that unravels it all. The consul scoffed, though his voice trembled. You are bluffing, PYNE. That diary means nothing. Oh, it means everything, PYNE countered, flipping through the worn pages. This diary belonged to Lady Esther Carr herself. It's filled with her thoughts, her fears, and most importantly, her account of your blackmail. Muriel gasped softly, her hands clutching the edge of her chair. Blackmail? She whispered, her voice trembling. PYNE nodded solemnly, turning to her. Yes, Muriel, Mr. Ambrose here discovered that Lady Esther had inherited her family's fortune under rather questionable circumstances. He used this knowledge to extort her, knowing she'd do anything to keep it a secret. And when you assumed her identity after her tragic death, he saw an opportunity, a terrified young woman with everything to lose. Lies, Ambrose spat, standing abruptly. You have no proof of any of this. PYNE raised a brow, holding the diary aloft. This diary is proof enough. Lady Esther wrote of her dread, her regret, and her suspicion that you might one day push her too far. She even details how you threatened to expose her family's deepest secrets unless she complied with your demands. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But you made one fatal mistake, Mr. Ambrose. You underestimated her resolve and you underestimated me. Ambrose's face twisted with rage and fear. You can't prove I had anything to do with her death. No, PYNE admitted, his tone deceptively light. But I can prove you've been manipulating Muriel since the moment she stepped into Lady Esther's shoes, and I imagine the authorities will find that very interesting. The room fell silent. Schlegel, his fists clenched, took a step forward. You ruined her life, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You let her live in fear for something she didn't even do. Muriel, tears streaming down her face, looked up at Schlegel. I didn't know. I didn't know how to escape. I thought if I played the part, no one would question it, but it only made things worse. Schlegel turned to her, his expression softening. Muriel, he said gently, you've done nothing wrong. You've been caught in a nightmare. But it's time to wake up. You don't have to live in fear anymore. Muriel's lips trembled as she whispered, but what if no one believes me? What if the truth doesn't matter? PYNE stepped closer, his gaze steady and reassuring. The truth always matters, Muriel. It may take time, and it may face resistance, but in the end it has a way of finding its place. You have more strength than you realize, and now you have people who believe in you. Schlegel reached for her hand, his voice firm yet tender. And I'll stand by you no matter what. I should have said this sooner, but I love you, Muriel. I always have, and I won't let you face this alone. Muriel stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and gratitude. Slowly, a faint smile broke through her tears. Thank you, she whispered. PYNE cleared his throat, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. A touching moment indeed, but we still have some unfinished business. He turned back to Ambrose, whose defiance had crumbled into desperation. You won't get away with this, PYNE, Ambrose hissed. You think you are so clever, but you are just a meddling fool. Perhaps, PYNE said with a shrug, but a meddling fool who happens to have uncovered the truth, and in this case, the truth is far more powerful than any threat you can make. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hall. PYNE smiled faintly. Ah, that would be the local authorities. I took the liberty of informing them about our little gathering. Ambrose's face turned ashen as two officers entered the room, their stern expressions leaving no room for argument. Mr. Ambrose, one of them said, you are under arrest for extortion, conspiracy, and a long list of other charges we'll be happy to discuss at the station. As the officers led Ambrose away, the tension in the room began to dissipate. Schlegel turned to Muriel, his hand still clasping hers. It's over, he said softly. You are free now. Later that evening, PYNE found himself standing at the tomb of Hafez, the poet's words etched into the stone before him. The desert breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of quiet resolution. Fragile things,